The lights in the Great Hall of Nexus Prime had never felt so cold before, and the 12 alien delegates sat around the massive crystal table in complete silence as they stared at the empty chair that should have held Admiral Kate Morrison but instead held nothing but air and the weight of questions no one could answer. Commander Vextal of the Xanthari delegation moved his scaled fingers across the smooth surface of his datapad and watched the same reports flash before his eyes for the 100th time in 3 days, and each time the words remained exactly the same and exactly impossible to believe. Every human settlement across the galaxy had gone silent at the exact same moment 72 hours ago, and not one distress signal had been sent, and not one body had been found, and not one ship had shown any signs of struggle or damage. The Xanthari had always prided themselves on their logical minds and their ability to solve any puzzle. But this made no sense at all, and Vextal felt something he had never experienced before, which was the cold touch of fear running down his spine. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been in her lab on Research Station Gamma when it happened, and the security cameras showed her working on a complex genetic sample at 1400 hours exactly. And then the next frame showed an empty room with her coffee cup still steaming on the metal counter, and her notes scattered across the desk as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The station's artificial intelligence had recorded no unusual energy readings and no signs of teleportation technology, and no indication that anything had happened at all, except that every single human on the station was simply gone. The other species who worked alongside the humans continued their duties for several hours before realizing that something was terribly wrong, and by then, it was far too late to understand what had occurred. Council Leader Thyman floated above, his seat in the way that all ethereals did, and his translucent form shimmered with the pale blue light that meant he was deep in thought, but even his advanced mind could not process what had happened to an entire species. The ethereals had evolved beyond physical form millions of years ago, and they understood energy and consciousness better than any other race in the galaxy. But humans had always been different, and their consciousness had patterns that no one could fully map or predict. Thyman had spent decades trying to understand human emotions and their strange ability to make decisions based on feelings rather than logic, and just when he thought he was beginning to grasp their nature, they had all disappeared without explanation. The Catherian delegate spoke in the musical tones that her species used for communication, and her words translated through the universal language system as confusion and worry about the trade networks that humans had helped maintain for centuries. Captain Ryan Parker had been the chief mediator for the Outer Rim disputes, and his strange way of finding solutions that satisfied everyone had kept peace between species that should have been at war with each other. The Catherians valued harmony above all else, but they achieved it through careful planning and precise negotiations, while humans seemed to create peace through chaos and intuition and emotions that made no logical sense. Ambassador Jack Coleman had prevented 3 major conflicts in the past year alone through methods that the other species found baffling and primitive but somehow effective. He would sit with angry delegates and listen to their complaints and then suggest solutions that seemed to come from nowhere, but always worked better than the careful strategies that the Council's best minds could devise. Now the tensions that his presence had kept under control were already beginning to surface, and several trade disputes had escalated to threats of military action in just 3 days. The massive view screen at the end of the hall displayed images from human colonies across the galaxy, and every single one told the same impossible story. New Terra showed empty streets with hover cars still running, and doors left open and meals half finished on tables, as if the entire population had simply stepped outside for a moment and forgotten to return. The industrial world of Kepler 7 had all its factories still operating under automated systems, but the human supervisors who had kept everything running smoothly were nowhere to be found. Mining Station Alpha reported that all equipment was functioning perfectly, but the human engineers who had designed the complex systems had vanished, and no one else could understand their unconventional maintenance schedules. Professor Nancy Williams had been working on her research into quantum consciousness networks when she disappeared, and her laboratory on Science Station Beta contained notes and equations that no other species could interpret. Her work had been on the verge of a breakthrough in understanding how human minds connected to the greater fabric of reality in ways that defied all known scientific principles. The other researchers who had worked with her found her calculations impossible to follow because they included variables labeled with things like intuition and gut feeling, and emotional resonance, which were not scientific concepts that could be measured or quantified. The silence in the council chamber stretched on as each delegate processed the magnitude of what had occurred, and slowly a new feeling began to emerge among them, which was something that could almost be called relief. Humans had always been the most unpredictable members of the galactic community, and their tendency to ignore established protocols and make emotional decisions had caused countless headaches. For the more logical species, they refused to follow proper procedures and insisted on doing things their own way, and somehow their chaotic methods often produced better results than careful planning and systematic approaches. Council leader Thymon finally spoke, and his words carried the weight of authority that came from leading the most advanced civilization in the galaxy. He suggested that perhaps this was an opportunity for the remaining species to bring proper order to galactic affairs without the constant interference of human unpredictability. The other delegates murmured their agreement, and the idea began to take shape that they could finally organize things according to logical principles without having to accommodate human emotions and intuition. The vote was called and passed unanimously to redistribute human territories and assets among the 12 remaining species, and the council began making plans to divide up the vast network of colonies and space stations and research facilities that humans had built. They felt confident that their superior technology and logical minds could easily manage whatever systems the humans had left behind, and they looked forward to a more orderly and predictable galaxy. None of them suspected that they had just made the biggest mistake in galactic history. 3 weeks had passed since the human disappearance, and the first cracks in galactic civilization began to show themselves in ways that none of the council members had expected or prepared for. The automated defense grid that protected the core world started sending error messages that made no sense to the Zenthari technicians, who prided themselves on understanding every piece of technology in the galaxy, but found themselves staring at code that seemed to have been written by someone who thought in completely different patterns. Commander Vextal stood in the primary control room of Defense Station 1 and watched his best engineers struggle with systems that should have been simple to maintain, but instead proved impossible to understand because every line of code contained references to human intuition and decision-making processes that no logical mind could follow. Captain Ryan Parker had designed these defense systems with a level of complexity that went far beyond normal programming, and his personal notes were filled with phrases like, "Trust your feelings," and "Sometimes the rules need to be broken," and "When in doubt, follow your gut instinct." The Zenthari engineers read these instructions with growing frustration because their species had evolved beyond such primitive concepts as feelings and instincts, and they operated purely on logic and mathematical precision. They tried to replace the human elements with proper algorithms, but every change they made caused the entire system to become less effective and more prone to failures that seemed to cascade through the network in unpredictable ways. The quantum encryption protocols that protected the defense grid proved even more challenging because they had been designed to respond to human thought patterns in ways that defied conventional understanding of how security systems should function. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had worked on these protocols, and her research notes showed that she had somehow programmed the system to recognize not just specific access codes, but also the emotional state and intentions of the person trying to access it. The concept of emotional recognition in a security system made no sense to species that had long ago abandoned such inefficient ways of processing information, but somehow it worked perfectly when humans were operating it, and failed completely when anyone else tried to use it. On the industrial world of Kepler-7, the massive terraforming engines that had been running smoothly for decades suddenly began to malfunction in ways that the replacement Cytherian engineers could not explain or fix. Engineer Lisa Murphy had maintained these systems using schedules that followed no logical pattern and seemed to be based entirely on her ability to somehow sense when each machine needed attention. Her maintenance logs contained entries like Engine 3 sounds unhappy today, and Reactor 5 feels sluggish and needs some extra care, which drove the logical Cytherian minds to distraction because machines could not be unhappy or sluggish, and feelings had nothing to do with mechanical maintenance. The Cytherian engineers followed proper maintenance protocols based on manufacturer specifications and operating hours, But the ancient machines responded by breaking down in new and creative ways that seemed almost deliberate. The atmospheric processors that kept the planet's air breathable started producing gas mixtures that met all technical requirements, but somehow felt wrong to the colonists who lived there, and many began reporting headaches and fatigue that medical scans could not explain. The terraforming computers showed all systems operating within normal parameters, but the planet itself seemed to be slowly dying, and no amount of logical analysis could determine why. Trade networks across 3 sectors began to collapse as old. Disputes that humans had somehow kept under control erupted into open conflicts between species that should have been natural allies. Ambassador Jack Coleman had spent years mediating between the mineral-rich Draconis system and the manufacturing worlds of the Vega cluster, and his strange ability to understand what each group really wanted beneath their stated demands had kept a profitable relationship running smoothly for decades. Without his emotional insights, the negotiations quickly broke down into accusations and threats, as each side insisted on terms that the other found completely unacceptable. The Zenthari delegation tried to mediate using proper diplomatic protocols and careful analysis of each side's economic needs, but they could not understand why the Draconians kept making demands that seemed to have nothing to do with trade agreements, and why the Vegans responded with anger to offers that should have been perfectly reasonable. What the logical minds missed was that the dispute had never really been about mineral rights or manufacturing quotas, but about respect and recognition, and the feeling that each group's contributions were valued by their trading partners. These emotional undercurrents were invisible to species that had evolved beyond such concerns, but they were the real foundation of successful trade relationships. Professor Nancy Williams had been studying the quantum consciousness network that somehow connected all sentient minds across the galaxy, and her research had revealed patterns that suggested humans played a unique role in maintaining the stability of this cosmic web. Her laboratory notes contained references to the human factor, which she described as an inexplicable ability to adapt to any situation and find solutions that worked even when they should not have been possible according to established scientific principles. Without human consciousness contributing to the network, the delicate balance began to shift in ways that caused psychic storms affecting several telepathic species. The ethereal collective experienced the first major disruption when their shared consciousness network became unstable and began producing feedback loops that caused painful disruptions in their mental unity. The ethereals had always been able to share thoughts and emotions seamlessly across vast distances, but now their connections were filled with static and interference that made communication difficult and coordination nearly impossible. Council Leader Thyman found himself cut off from the collective wisdom of his people for the first time in his existence, and the isolation was more terrifying than anything he had ever experienced. On Research Station Beta, the quantum consciousness monitoring equipment started registering readings that made no sense according to current scientific understanding, and the automated systems began reporting ghost signals from empty space where no conscious minds should have existed. Dr. Amanda Foster had designed these instruments to detect and measure consciousness patterns, but her calibration methods had included adjustments for human intuition that allowed the equipment to sense things that purely logical analysis would miss. Without those adjustments, the instruments became unreliable and began producing data that contradicted everything the scientific community thought they knew about the nature of consciousness itself. The council convened for an emergency session, and the tension in the chamber was obvious as delegates struggled to understand how their advanced civilizations could be so dependent on a species they had always considered primitive and chaotic. Council leader Thyman admitted that the ethereals were experiencing unprecedented difficulties with their consciousness network, and Commander Vextal reported that critical defense systems were failing at an alarming rate. The Catherian delegate sang a mournful tune that translated as deep concern about the breakdown of trade relationships that had taken centuries to establish and maintain. For the first time since the formation of the Galactic Council, the member species began to realize that they might have made a serious error in judgment about the importance of human participation in galactic civilization, and the uncomfortable truth began to emerge that humans had not been lucky or chaotic, but had instead been the essential element that held everything together through methods that no other species could understand or replicate. 2 months after the human disappearance, the galaxy descended into chaos that spread like a plague across every sector and every system, as the careful balance that had maintained peace for centuries finally collapsed under the weight of misunderstanding and fear. The Great Library on Athena Prime became completely inaccessible when the neural interface systems that Dr. Amanda Foster had designed refused to respond to any non-human consciousness, and the vast databases of knowledge that represented the combined wisdom of a dozen civilizations remained locked behind barriers that no amount of technological expertise could overcome. The library's artificial intelligence continued to function, but it spoke only in riddles and references that made sense only to human minds, and every attempt to access the archives resulted in cryptic messages about emotional resonance and intuitive understanding that drove the logical alien researchers to desperation. Wars erupted across 3 major sectors as ancient grudges that humans had somehow kept buried for generations suddenly exploded into violence that consumed entire star systems and threatened to spread even further. The Draconis Mining Confederation launched surprise attacks against Cytherian trade convoys in retaliation for what they claimed were decades of unfair dealing. But the Cytherians had no idea what they had done wrong, because all their contracts had been negotiated according to proper legal procedures. What they failed to understand was that the Draconians had never cared about legal technicalities, but had instead valued the personal relationships and emotional connections that Ambassador Jack Coleman had fostered between the two species over many years of patient diplomacy. The Zenthari made the critical mistake of intercepting a Cytherian medical supply ship that was carrying vaccines to a plague-stricken colony, because their analysis indicated that the medical supplies could be used to create biological weapons. The Cytherians responded with outrage that seemed completely irrational to the logical Zenthari minds, but the attack triggered an ancient defense protocol that humans had quietly disabled decades earlier when they realized it could cause exactly this kind of escalation. The automated response launched a devastating counterattack that nearly destroyed both fleets before Council forces could intervene, and even then the damage was so severe that hundreds of lives were lost, and both species declared the other to be enemies of galactic peace. Professor Nancy Williams had been on the verge of a breakthrough in understanding the quantum consciousness network when she vanished, and her research into what she called the human factor had revealed that humans possessed an inexplicable ability to adapt to any situation and find solutions that worked even when they defied all logical analysis. Without human consciousness contributing to the network, the delicate quantum patterns that connected all sentient minds began to fluctuate wildly, and the psychic storms that resulted drove several telepathic species to the brink of madness as their ability to communicate with each other became unreliable and painful. The ethereal collective suffered the worst effects as their shared consciousness network completely collapsed, and individual ethereals found themselves trapped in isolation for the first time in millions of years of evolution. Council Leader Timon experienced the horror of being cut off from the collective wisdom of his people, and his attempts to maintain mental stability without the support of his species resulted in erratic behavior that frightened the other council members. The ethereals had evolved beyond individual identity, and the concept of being alone was so foreign to them that many began to suffer from what could only be described as psychic shock that left them unable to function effectively. Captain Ryan Parker had designed the quantum consciousness stabilizers that kept the network functioning smoothly, but his engineering notes contained calculations that included variables for human intuition and emotional resonance that no other species could understand or replicate. The automated systems continued to operate, but without human oversight they began to drift out of calibration, and the psychic storms became more frequent and more severe with each passing day. The telepathic species found their abilities becoming unreliable and dangerous as the network fed back chaotic energy that caused headaches and disorientation, and in some cases complete mental breakdown. The industrial infrastructure that kept galactic civilization running began to fail, as the complex systems that humans had designed and maintained proved impossible for other species to operate effectively. On Kepler-7, the terraforming engines finally shut down completely when the Cytherian engineers attempted to implement a logical maintenance schedule that ignored the intuitive timing that engineer Lisa Murphy had used to keep the ancient machines running. The planet's atmosphere began to revert to its original toxic composition, and the colonists faced the possibility of evacuation or death as their world became uninhabitable once again. Mining operations across the galaxy ground to a halt as the extraction equipment that had been optimized by human engineers refused to function properly under alien management. The machines had been programmed with adaptive algorithms that responded to operator intuition rather than rigid procedures, and without human operators who could sense when adjustments were needed, the equipment became inefficient and prone to dangerous failures that threatened the safety of workers and the productivity of entire operations. The defense grid protecting the core world suffered catastrophic failures as the quantum encryption protocols that Captain Ryan Parker had designed began to malfunction without human oversight. The system had been programmed to recognize and respond to human thought patterns in ways that provided both security and flexibility, but alien minds triggered defensive responses that locked down entire sectors and left them vulnerable to attack. Commander Vextel watched in horror as his own ships were fired upon by the very systems they were trying to protect, because the defense grid could not recognize Zenthari command codes as legitimate without human authorization. Transportation. Networks collapsed as the complex routing algorithms that had managed traffic flow across thousands of systems began to fail without human operators who could make intuitive adjustments to handle unexpected situations. Space lanes that had been safe for centuries became dangerous as automated systems made logical decisions that ignored the subtle factors that human traffic controllers had always considered when managing the flow of ships through crowded systems. Accidents increased dramatically, and several major shipping companies went bankrupt as their vessels were stranded in bureaucratic tangles that no amount of logical analysis could resolve. The medical research facilities that had made breakthrough discoveries in treating diseases affecting multiple species found themselves unable to continue their work without the human researchers who had provided crucial insights into the emotional and psychological factors that affected healing and recovery. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been working on treatments that combined traditional medicine with therapies that addressed the mental and emotional needs of patients, but her research notes contained references to concepts like hope and determination and will to live that were impossible for logical minds to quantify or replicate in clinical settings. Council leader Thyman called for another emergency session, but many delegates were unable to attend because of the chaos spreading through their home systems, and those who did manage to reach Nexus Prime arrived with reports of disaster and catastrophe that painted a picture of galactic civilization collapsing at an accelerating rate. The comfortable assumption that advanced technology and logical thinking could solve any problem had been shattered by the reality that humans had been the keystone species that held everything together through methods that no other race could understand or duplicate. The terrible truth became clear that humans had not been primitive or chaotic, but had instead possessed abilities that were essential for maintaining the complex balance of galactic civilization, and without them, the carefully constructed peace and prosperity that had lasted for centuries was crumbling into ruin with frightening speed. 6 months after humanity vanished from the galaxy, a battered probe emerged from the void beyond the galactic rim, and its appearance triggered every early warning system in Council space as the ancient vessel broadcast a signal that made the surviving civilizations stop their wars and listen with growing amazement and horror. The probe had been launched centuries ago by Captain Danny Mitchell during one of humanity's early exploration missions, and its simple artificial intelligence had been programmed with basic human values and decision-making processes that seemed primitive compared to modern technology, but had somehow guided it through the empty darkness beyond known space and back to deliver a message that would change everything the Council thought they understood about the human disappearance. Commander Angela Davis appeared on the probe's transmission as a hologram that flickered with interference from the vast distances it had traveled, but her words came through clearly as she spoke from what appeared to be a massive space station, floating in the cosmic void far beyond the edge of the galaxy. She explained that humanity had detected an approaching threat, unlike anything the galaxy had ever faced before, and that the machine intelligence heading toward their home was a force of destruction that consumed organic life to fuel its endless expansion across the universe. The entity had been tracking humanity through quantum signatures that were unique to human consciousness, and its approach meant certain death for every living being in the galaxy unless drastic action was taken immediately. The revelation that Humans had known about this threat for years, sent shockwaves through the council chambers as delegates realized that every strange human behavior and every seemingly irrational decision had been part of a desperate preparation for a sacrifice that no other species could have imagined making. Ambassador Jack Coleman had been working to strengthen relationships between species, not because he enjoyed diplomacy, but because he knew that unity would be essential for survival when humanity was no longer there to hold everything together. Professor Nancy Williams had been researching quantum consciousness networks not out of scientific curiosity, but because she was trying to find ways to maintain galactic stability after human minds were removed from the equation. Captain Ryan Parker had designed defense systems and infrastructure with built-in redundancies and adaptive capabilities, not because he was showing off his engineering skills, but because he was trying to create technology that could function without human oversight when the time came for his species to disappear. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been working on medical treatments and biological research that would help other species adapt to new challenges, not because she wanted to advance science, but because she knew they would need every advantage they could get when facing an enemy that humanity could barely comprehend, let alone defeat. The machine intelligence that pursued humanity across space was older than most civilizations, and had consumed entire galaxies in its endless hunger for organic matter that it converted into computational power and raw materials for expansion. Commander Davis explained that the entity had been following human quantum signatures for decades and was closing in on the galaxy with a fleet of world-killing vessels that could strip planets bare of life in a matter of hours. The only way to protect the galaxy was for humanity to voluntarily exile itself beyond the galactic barrier and take their quantum signatures with them so that the machines would follow them into the void instead of attacking the core worlds. The recording revealed that humans had spent decades preparing for this moment and had tried to create systems and protocols that would allow galactic civilization to continue functioning without them. But they had underestimated how quickly everything would fall apart once human intuition and adaptability were removed from the equation. Every peace treaty had been negotiated with human emotions and understanding as the foundation, and every piece of critical technology had been designed to work with human operators who could make intuitive adjustments when logical procedures failed to address unexpected situations. Dr. Amanda Foster had tried to program artificial intelligence systems that could replicate human decision-making processes, but her research had shown that human consciousness operated on principles that could not be reduced to algorithms or logical frameworks. The Great Library's neural interface had been designed to respond to human thought patterns because human minds approached knowledge and learning in ways that were fundamentally different from other species and could make connections between seemingly unrelated concepts that led to breakthrough discoveries and innovative solutions. Engineer Lisa Murphy had attempted to create maintenance schedules and operating procedures that would allow other species to keep critical infrastructure running smoothly. But her efforts had been frustrated by the reality that human maintenance techniques relied on abilities that could not be taught or transferred to logical minds. The terraforming engines and atmospheric processors and industrial equipment that kept colonies functioning had been optimized for human operators who could sense problems before they became critical and make adjustments based on intuition rather than diagnostic readings. Commander Davis continued her explanation with words that chilled every delegate in the council chambers as she described the true scope of the threat approaching their galaxy. The machine intelligence was not just another enemy that could be fought with conventional weapons, but was instead a force of nature that had been consuming organic life for millions of years and had developed countermeasures for every logical strategy that advanced civilizations could devise. Only the chaotic and unpredictable nature of human consciousness had proven capable of confusing and delaying the machines long enough for evacuation and escape. The sacrifice that humanity had made was not just leaving the galaxy, but accepting the responsibility of leading the machine intelligence on a chase through the cosmic void that would continue until either the machines were destroyed or humanity was completely eliminated. Commander Davis admitted that they had been fighting a running battle for months and that their defenses were beginning to fail under the relentless pressure of an enemy that learned from every encounter and adapted its tactics to counter human strategies with terrifying efficiency. The final part of the transmission revealed the terrible timeline that the galaxy now faced as Commander Davis reported that humanity could maintain their protective barrier for perhaps one more year before their defenses collapsed, and the machine, intelligence, realized that it had been led away from its true target. When that happened, the machines would return to the galaxy with renewed fury and advanced knowledge of how to counter the defensive systems that humans had built, and the surviving species would face an enemy that was prepared for everything except the one thing they no longer possessed, which was human unpredictability and emotional resilience. Commander Davis concluded her message with words that echoed through the silence of the council chambers and burned themselves into the memory of every delegate who heard them. She explained that humans had tried to prepare the galaxy for their absence but had failed to account for how quickly logical minds would abandon the emotional connections and intuitive understanding that held civilization together. The galaxy would need to learn from humanity's example and find ways to work together despite their differences, or they would all die when the machines returned to finish what they had started. The transmission ended with a view of the human fleet, scattered across the void beyond the galaxy, and the sight of their ships glowing with weapon fire as they continued their desperate battle against an enemy that seemed endless and unstoppable. For the first time in their civilization's histories, the council delegates truly understood what sacrifice meant and what it cost to protect those you loved even when they could never know or appreciate what you had given up for their survival. The truth about humanity's sacrifice changed everything, and the council delegates found themselves facing a choice that would define the future of galactic civilization, as they realized they had less than a year to prepare for an enemy that had consumed entire galaxies and would return with knowledge of how to counter every logical defense strategy they could devise. Council leader Thymon struggled with the isolation that had plagued his people since the consciousness network collapsed, but found new purpose in the desperate need to unite the surviving species in ways that had never been attempted before. Commander Vextal put aside his pride in Zenthari logic and began studying the human training programs that had been dismissed as primitive and emotional, but now represented their only hope of learning to think in ways that might confuse and delay the machine intelligence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when military archivists discovered Lieutenant Ben Roberts' combat training simulations hidden deep in the Defense Force databases and initially dismissed as worthless because they violated every principle of logical military strategy. The simulations forced non-human cadets to make decisions based on intuition rather than analysis, and required them to trust emotional responses instead of calculated risk assessments. Commander Vextal watched in amazement as Zenthari officers, who had been trained to follow precise protocols, learned to embrace chaos and unpredictability as viable tactical options. Dr. Amanda Foster's research notes provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. When scientists finally understood that her work on consciousness networks had not been theoretical, but had been practical preparation for the day when human minds would no longer be available to stabilize the quantum connections between species. Her experiments had shown that other forms of consciousness could learn to mimic human emotional patterns if they were willing to abandon their reliance on pure logic and embrace the messy complexity of feelings and instincts that humans use to navigate impossible situations. The Catherian delegates discovered that their musical communication could be adapted to include emotional harmonics that resonated with the quantum consciousness network in ways similar to human thought patterns, and their songs began to carry new meanings that helped stabilize the psychic storms that had been plaguing telepathic species. The ethereals learned to accept individual identity as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good, and Council leader Thymon found that his isolation from the collective actually gave him new insights into the importance of personal relationships and emotional connections that his species had abandoned long ago. Engineer Lisa Murphy's maintenance logs became required reading for technicians across the galaxy, as they struggled to understand how machines could be treated as living entities that responded to emotional care rather than just technical procedures. The Catherian engineers working on Kepler-7 finally succeeded in restarting the terraforming engines when they began listening to the sounds the machines made and responding to what could only be described as mechanical moods rather than following rigid diagnostic protocols. The Great Library on Athena Prime slowly began to unlock its secrets as researchers learned to approach knowledge with human-style curiosity and wonder rather than systematic analysis. and the artificial intelligence that guarded the archives started responding to questions asked with emotional investment rather than detached scientific interest. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's medical research proved invaluable as species learned to treat psychological and emotional trauma that resulted from the collapse of their ordered societies and the fear of facing an enemy that threatened everything they had ever known. Training programs based on human methods spread across the galaxy as the surviving species discovered that chaos and unpredictability could be learned skills rather than primitive weaknesses, and that emotional decision-making often produced better results than careful logical analysis when dealing with complex situations that had no clear solutions. The Xanthari military adapted human tactics that emphasized improvisation and creative problem-solving, while the Catherian diplomatic corps learned to negotiate based on emotional understanding rather than trade calculations. As the months passed, and the machine intelligence drew closer to breaking through humanity's sacrificial barrier, the galaxy began to transform in ways that would have seemed impossible before the human disappearance. Ancient enemies became allies as they learned to value emotional connections over logical advantages, and species that had never cooperated before found common ground in their shared determination to honor the sacrifice that humanity had made for their survival. The first sign that their efforts were succeeding came when the quantum consciousness network began to stabilize as non-human minds learned to contribute the emotional resonance that had been missing since humanity's departure. The psychic storms that had driven telepathic species to madness gradually subsided as the ethereals discovered how to maintain individual identity while still sharing consciousness with others, and the Xanthari learned to trust intuitive insights that complemented their logical analysis. When the machine intelligence finally broke through humanity's defensive barrier and turned back toward the galaxy, they encountered something they had never faced before, which was a united collection of species that had learned to fight like humans with unpredictability and emotional resilience and creative chaos that defied all logical analysis. The machines had spent months adapting to human tactics and had developed countermeasures for every strategy that logical minds could devise, but they were completely unprepared for the sight of Xanthari ships using human-style improvisation and Catherian vessels employing emotional decision-making, and ethereal forces fighting with individual initiative rather than collective planning. The battle for the galaxy became a testament to everything humans had tried to teach their alien friends as species that had never worked together before, coordinated attacks based on intuition rather than communication, and made tactical decisions that succeeded precisely because they made no logical sense. Ship formations that should have been disasters somehow achieved victory through the sheer audacity of commanders who had learned to trust their feelings rather than their instruments, and battle plans that violated every principle of military strategy succeeded because they embraced the chaos that humans had always understood was the secret to defeating seemingly impossible odds. The machine intelligence found itself facing an enemy that it could not predict or counter, because the galaxy had learned the most important lesson that humanity could teach, which was that logic alone was not enough to solve every problem, and that sometimes the best solutions came from the heart rather than the mind. As the last machine ship was destroyed in a final battle that defied every rule of space combat, the surviving species made a unanimous decision that surprised no one who understood what they had learned about the meaning of family and loyalty and sacrifice. The largest fleet in galactic history assembled at the edge of known space and prepared to cross the barrier into the cosmic void, not as conquerors seeking glory or as desperate refugees fleeing danger, but as family members determined to bring their lost relatives home. They had learned that power meant nothing without purpose, and that the greatest strength came not from technology or weapons, but from the bonds between people who cared about each other enough to risk everything for the chance to be together again. The final transmission sent on all frequencies as the rescue fleet departed carried a message that would have made every human proud, as the galaxy declared its intention to find humanity and share the burden of protecting their home together, because that was what families did for each other, and they had finally learned that they were all part of the same family, regardless of what planet they came from or what species they belonged to.